Hello, and welcome to Sophia's Roulette. Please be encouraged to put any questions in the chat for the purpose of the recording. Everyone will be muted except for the speaker. After the lecture, we will take a 10-minute break and start the question and answer period. The room will remain open. Please do be encouraged to join us on June 18th, where Dr. Khosla will be lecturing on totalitarianism. The link to Kiala will be posted in the chat and with the recording on Sophia's Roulette YouTube channel, along with source material for this evening's lecture. Tonight, we have the scintillating Dr. Tamana Khosla, author of The Feminist Manifesto and China, India, Russia, Rise of the Euro-Asian Civilization, professor, feminist, individualist. The topic for this evening is West and Architecture, a view from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Tamana, if you would like to introduce yourself a little bit and begin the lecture, I am ready.
I guess you've introduced me quite well, so I don't need to kind of repeat it myself. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing me. And today's lecture is on critique of Western architecture. And, because architecture is greatly related to colonial overpowering of several countries in Africa, Asia, and Middle East, and eastern parts of the world. So, I mean, as far as the buildings are concerned, they are symbolic of cultural hegemony, and the fact that these structures point out to the fact that they decrease the value of the indigenous culture, and they bring into power their own cultures. So India, for example, the British, for example, during the Cholas and the Pandyas, history, in the long back during the in the south of India, for example, we have our own temples, which are amazingly architectured. We have Ajanta Ellora, for example, so they have been, so any kingdom which comes into being, they have their own architecture, for example, so for example, if you look at the Mughal Empire had its own architecture, and it added on to Indian values. So we have become a hybrid culture, where we have buildings of every kingdom has contributed to India's architecture. Similarly, it's with the Middle East, Africa, and eastern countries such as China, and many of these countries, which have suffered times of Western colonialism. So here I would like to quote Homi Bhabha, one of the most major post-colonialists in our being. And so the professor says, the colonial presence is always ambivalent, split between its appearance as original and authoritative, and its articulation as repetition and difference. So it's repeating itself. For example, the British, for example, they were repeating themselves, but they were making themselves different as well. So, it is a disjunction produced within the act of enunciation as a specifically colonial articulation of those two disproportionate sides of colonial discourse and power. The colonial scene as the invention of historicity, mastery, mimesis, or as the other scene of displacement, fantasy, psychic defense, and an open textuality. So an open textuality towards this particular scenario is what Homi Bhabha is trying to say. So for example, the British were inventing their historicity when they were having this architecture into place. So, for example, we have many of our for example, the parliament, and, many of our structures, our cities, Chandigarh, for example, Punjab, Chandigarh has been built on British model. So, and till the time a country is not truly free, it is going to rely on Western architecture. But when a country becomes truly free, it has its own culture and its own architecture, which is going to look into this being and have their own architecture. So in Homi Bhabha's Sign Taken for Wonders, the English book is presented as unintended vehicle of hybridization and ambivalence. So somewhere, Indians are Indians or the Middle Eastern are it's a hybrid, hybrid and ambivalent as well. Both of them are working together. They are ambivalent plus they are hybridized. So the architecture is done in a way that both these things come into play together. So yeah. Colonial architecture shares many of the characteristics of this transfer, and like Bhabha's English book, it can be regarded as an insignia of colonial authority and signifier of colonial desire and discipline. So it's basically the desire of colonial colonial power to dominate the colonialized country and bring in their own structures and their own architectural structures within those countries, so that their culture becomes totally powerful. Because buildings are something, for example, Ayn Rand spoke about in her book Fountainhead about the architect. So Roark, for example, so how he was isolated, and he was one of the best, and so how in Fountainhead, for example, the Atlas needs to be shrugged. They should stop working because they are the best. And so architects do a great work. For example, Bhabha's reasoning can be best applied to the early stages of history of colonial architecture. For instance, the English in India and the French in Indochina and Northern Africa tried to retain control of the semantic content of the styles in which they were built. Yeah. So English in India and French in Indochina and North Africa controlled the architectural structures in those countries. And that is what is now being, now as far as India is concerned, Africa is built of African states like Nigeria, etc., Sudan, and they have a lot of tribes. For example, India has a lot of religions. So every place in India, for example, will see a different architectural monument. For example, the Islamic structures would be there. There would be in the south of India, for example, there'll be their own. In West Bengal, there would be their own, because we are a very religious country. So, for example, the temples are extremely important structures of architecture. So in South India, you have amazing structures of temples, like they have been made by single stone, for example, on a single stone. So amazing, during the early centuries, these buildings have been built and still they're running strong, like their works are amazing. So yeah. At the same time, however, the local elites were freely using elements of Western architectural vocabulary to create their own hybrid products. So, but it wasn't that, these the local elites were also using the Western structures, to build their own countries, bring about development in their own countries, through the buildings. So in so doing, they forced a semantic shift that subverted the Western canon in a way that upsets European claim to exclusive semantic and representational rights. So, it's like they are critiquing as well as borrowing. So that's what Bhava is trying to say, it's like a hybridization, it's like, it's a hybrid structure which they are following. As Thomas Metcalfe and Wright have shown, the history of architecture and urbanism in colonial settings developed into a narrative of adaptive strategies that were closely related to changing policies of colonial rule. In both French and British colonies, there were a gradual move from building in styles imported from the metropole to the adoption of elements from the local architecture. So what Wright would say is, administrators hoped that preserving traditional status hierarchies would buttress their own superimposed colonial order. Architects, in turn, acknowledging that resistance to new forms is often based on affections for familiar places, tried to evoke a sense of continuity with the local past in their design. So, what I'm trying to say is that these elites who were within the country, they were trying to borrow not just from local past, but also from the West. So, and this is what Wright is trying to say. In the period between the two world wars, the second phase of syncretic design would in turn be superseded by a policy of modernization that was translated architecturally as an extension of so-called international style. So during the Second World War, the whole concept of international style within the architecture came into being. This trend in many cases was continued even after independence by the new ruling elites and the architects. So, for example, in India, new structures were built, but, the influence of British was not gone, because, the Rashtrapati Bhavan, etc., they were built on Indian, but they were hybridized, they were like, and they were not solely based on Indian culture. So, that's the beauty of it, actually. And so, yeah, this trend in many cases was continued even after independence by the new ruling elites and their architects. Political ambitions are not inherent in architectural forms, whether the forms are modern or historical, whether the politics of patrons are conservative or radical. So political ambitions are not inherent in architectural forms. Though I would say politics is relevant everywhere. So when you make structure, in India we have a new parliament building. It's like again, it's a hybrid, and we have a new parliament building which is coming up. It's like a very big achievement for the government. And so, yeah. So, so politics is involved. You can't say I'll agree. I disagree with the Wright when he says that politics is not involved in architecture. Everywhere politics is there, and it's involved everywhere. So the history of colonial architecture, however, also includes many instances of building design related to what Mark Crinson has termed informal imperialism, whereby control was established through the ostensibly peaceful means of free trade and economic integration into the orbit of European power. So, informal imperialism, whereby control was established through ostensibly peaceful means of free trade and economic integration into the orbit of European power was made. These were the site-specific cases that did not correspond to a general colonial ideology, as is the case of building of St. Mark Church in Alexandria, In our neo-colonialist times, examples of such seemingly isolated projects continue to be found, most notably in designs of multinational architectural firms. So the firms are the ones which are looking at, uh, you know, in a neo-colonialist way, they're like combining these things. So, the word of the day which I'll give is to architecture is hybridization, and that's the best thing because, we can take the best from, for example, we can take the best from China. The Han's dynasty had its own structure. So, I mean, the Confucius community had their own structures. And the best would be if we could, when in a country we are making an important, architecture is one of those areas where research has to be done much more. For example, Edward Said and all these people, they have written a lot about Africa and African architecture. But right now I'm not talking a bit too much because we don't have too much time. But but they have written a lot on architecture, because architecture and politics are mixed to each other. And colonialists had their impact on architecture of all these countries which were colonialized. In the 19th century, the architectural and urbanistic enterprise being undertaken in the colonies was also closely related to the general phenomena of Orientalism. Here comes Edward Said, Orientalism. And that was then emerging in Europe. Scholarly architects such as James Ferguson in India assembled encyclopedic histories of architecture that included local architecture, such as Illustrated Handbook of Architecture, 1855, that would later prove crucial in the creation of pseudo-Indian styles by British architects active in India. So pseudo-Indian styles were being built by British. They were not really Indian, but they were trying to portray and, keep the masses with them. So yeah, such hybrid styles can be understood through Bhabha's interpretation of the colonial strategy of disavowal, whereby the trace of what is disavowed is not repressed, but repeated as something different, a mutation, a hybrid. So architecture and dominance. In recent years, the study of colonial architecture and urbanism has been much expanded to include cases that might be considered unorthodox, such as imposition of principles of socialistic realism. That is also another issue in architecture in the areas under the influence of ex-Soviet Union. Greg Castillo described this process as colonial socialism and proposes the notion of Stalinistic empire, in which Moscow acted as colonial metropole and urban modern. So, socialistic model was also introduced in Soviet Union. Similarly in China, for example, how to introduce in architecture, socialism. Dominance is not exclusive to colonial cities, but the use and manifestation of dominance in the colonial context is particularly blunt. The editor himself contributes to the volume, which is Nazar al-Sayyad, one of the Middle Eastern thinkers, the Islamic city as colonial enterprise, where he poses the question, why is that in our use of colonial association, we talk about the urbanism that Arabs initiated or inherited in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia as Islamic urbanism and not colonial urbanism? Why is then that we persist in talking about Islamic cities instead of colonial cities of Islam? So, because of the influence of Western cities, Western architecture, what the author is saying is, why is then that we persist in talking about Islamic cities instead of colonial cities of Islam? So the influence of Islam on all these countries, Western architecture on these countries. The essays in forms of dominance is very much indebted to the work of Anthony D. King, King himself contributed to this particular thing. In post-colonial times, architecture and urbanism have continued to play an important role in enforcement of political control, often under the guise of national styles. So in other cases, architecture has served emergent economies to express their fascination for symbols of economic development and national progress. For example, the way I gave you the example, to show that, India is doing extremely well. A new parliament building, which is like really lavish, has been brought into picture. It has been critiqued by the opposition, for example, why to waste so much money on this grand project. But and that is what architecture is all about. Mr. Modi, he personally looked into it, and the opposition said that Mr. Modi it's his vanity fair. He's having his own agenda. He wants something which is very posh, and which looks like of something developing country moving into a developed world. So so architecture of a country can show you where the country is, where that particular country is moving. So it can also show if you are a multicultural nation or are you a monocultural nation. For example, Afghanistan, if you look at, you'll have a monocultural structures there, but obviously it's been destroyed since the 80s, and first Soviet Union came into being, came and dominated it, and then the western parts came into it, and so the war kind of keep beginning. But the monoculturalism, I mean, they have tribes, for example, but most of them are Islamic in belief. They're Islamic in belief. So that is why the monoculturalism. But in India, everywhere you go, you'll see the architectural difference and the influence of West, as well as the community, as well as the cultures which came in to dominate the country. For example, the Mughals, or the Cholas, Pandyas, the British, everybody, for example, the Buddha, for example, in Gaya, you have their own structures, the way Buddha perceived it. So, everywhere, you have their own structure. So that's like amazing. It's beautiful to see, but the politics behind it is not so simple. In the first half of the 1990s, several countries in Asia invested much effort and ingenuity in construction of skyscrapers, which not only challenged the legendary supremacy of American high-rise, but were also meant to represent these countries' new role on international stage. So, be it Dubai, for example, you have skyscrapers, new malls coming up, new buildings coming up, based on their own architects, and so they're challenging the Western hegemony and their culture, for example. So on the other hand, the challenge of designing an architecture of place beyond the universalism of modernistic movement and of corporate hubris is being encouraged by certain constituencies, such as Aga Khan Award, whose patronage is nonetheless often received with considerable degree of controversy. So international architectural firms, mostly based on US and Western Europe, have found an expanding and profitable market in former colonies. Their transnational practices place their designs within the more general framework of globalization and postmodernistic culture, architecture. But in some cases, these categories overlap with the reality of late colonialism in ways that throw a strong light on the continued dominance of Western canon. So Western canon has continued in late colonialism as well, because if you see Middle East, for example, they have amazing influence of American. America is dominating them, in a big way. And obviously as a world leader, it needs to. China is now getting into the whole mold, and so it's also emerging as a resilient power. And in the case of Norman Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai bank headquarters, a high-tech office building integrated Chinese geomancy principles, but it was also a monument to corporate and technological power erected in one of the last colonies of former British Empire. So, I mean, as I was talking about China as well, so, there is a hybridization. That is what is happening worldwide right now. The buildings, be it in Dubai, etc., they're skyscrapers, but, they are like built on, the architects are borrowing from every culture. So, but majorly from their own cultures. So the whole concept of multiculturalism is spread out. It's not just that the liberal democracy is dominant and their structures are dominant, but the fact that these structures have their own cultures and they are influencing, they are being influenced by their own culture, but also borrowing from other states. So, but let's look at the one of the criticisms of modern architecture is that although the modern architecture movement could have developed in a positive direction, it degenerated into a mere style. And one has to ask what has drained away from the social content and substituted another. Our modern unpleasant cities with their pollution and stress are a kind of illness that reflects not only global environmental sickness, but also a wider crisis in human condition. Low-income projects have become worse centers of delinquency, vandalism, and general social hopelessness than the slums they were supposed to replace. In India, for example, the slums they were supposed to replace, they haven't really done the good work. This is not rebuilding of cities, this is sacking of cities. So then there are technological failures, cultural failures. They build form, size, appearance, and location result not simply from physical factors such as materials, climate, or technology, but from society's ideas, its forms of economic and social organizations, and beliefs and values which prevail at any one time. Society produces its buildings, and the buildings help to maintain many of its social norms. So many of the social forms, for example, are a result of the architecture of that country. The built environment has both subtle and profound influence on the psychological well-being of individuals and an entire community. Climatic failure, another issue which the architecture literature needs to focus on. Even before the energy crisis of 1973, the failure of modern building to cope with variety of climates was apparent. They relied on technology, artificial ventilation, and air conditioning to provide comfortable conditions. Local and traditional methods that had evolved simple and successful means of achieving comfort were ignored. Large areas of glass were employed in all climates, hot or cold. So the richer countries of the world should feel guilty for the statistics that have often been quoted since 1970. 6% of the world's population consumes more than 35% of the resources. Roughly 70% of the energy used in US is attributable to urbanization. Thus, this includes transportation, heating, lighting, and power, and generation of power itself. Western modernity is consequence of Western social, economic, and industrial circumstances. It has its own shortcomings, not only for the people in the West, but also for the environment and resources everywhere. It is neither affordable nor indeed relevant to the economic, social, and cultural needs of the rest of the world. So in the end, I'll just speak about sustainability is the way forward. In the case of built environment, it is the duty of architects and designers to see that more sustainable technologies are used. We need to develop new approaches and solutions, which means selecting appropriate technologies, using the best, not the cheapest method of construction, employing life cycle assessments, seeking out local sources of energy and materials, employing local building skills and know-how. As every country now is like, out of the colonial hang up. So such a sustainable architecture may have following characteristics. The architecture should be reversible. Any technology which uses cement and concrete will be irreversible. Once it is done, if the building is to be dismantled, it produces waste materials. On the other hand, timber and steel structures are reversible. A. B. Architecture should use fewer energy materials and renewable materials. Steel and cement are very high energy intensive materials. Generally, less energy intensive techniques are more labor intensive. However, in a country like India, where cheap labor is available, these high energy intensive techniques can be used. This will have the dual advantages of reducing construction related carbon dioxide emissions, as well as generating employment. So I'll stop it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shalana. I am very grateful to you. Okay, we are going to take a 10-minute break. I'm going to wrap up the video. Thank you for everyone who came to listen or is watching this on Sophia's Roulette. Please don't forget that Dr. Tamana is the author of 2 books. One is The Feminist Manifesto, and the other is China, India, Russia, Rise of the Euro-Asian Civilization. She's a professor, a feminist, and an individualist, and we all love her because she is scintillating.